In February 1909, a fire burned down the Boone County Courthouse in central Missouri. While looking through the saved items, people found Sheriff Cartwright's private notebook. The pages showed names, dates, and money amounts covering 30 years. One entry was strange. Grace Talbot, age 17, written next to farm animals and property sales. Before we dive into the story, quick question. What's the scariest case you've ever heard about or seen? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. And while you're here, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel. We're building a group of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The notebook had been kept away from regular county records, hidden in Cartwright's desk drawer for reasons that became clear when people looked at it. Each page showed deals that never appeared in public files, organized by date and marked very carefully. Land sales, farm animal sales, crops from different farms throughout the county, normal farm record keeping for rural Missouri in the early 1900s. But hidden within these normal entries, certain notes were different. They appeared sometimes, always in the same careful handwriting, always following the same pattern. A name, an age, a location, and an amount of money. Sometimes the entries included more details, how long, specific plans, names of other people involved. The pattern repeated across years, across decades, telling a story that existed in the spaces between official history. Grace Talbot, age 17, appeared in an entry dated November 1918. The note placed her next to farm animal transfers and property trades from the Talbot family land in the hills north of Columbia. No explanation came with her name. No reason why a young woman's details appeared in a document tracking farm business. Sheriff Cartwright had died in the courthouse fire, taking his knowledge of these entries with him. But the notebook itself survived, passed to his replacement along with boxes of other saved documents. For months, it sat unlooked at, just another item from a destroyed collection. Only when a routine check into property arguments required looking at old land records did anyone notice the strange pattern hidden within the pages. The new sheriff, a man named Douglas Finch, who'd moved from Kansas City, knew right away that these entries meant something beyond normal record keeping. He'd seen similar paperwork before in cases involving taking advantage of people and trafficking in city settings. But this notebook suggested something different. Something that had worked for 3 decades in plain sight, protected by being far away and the kind of silence that rural communities kept when outsiders asked questions. Finch began comparing the names against county birth records, marriage papers, tax documents. Most of the people listed in the suspicious entries came from a handful of families living in the far-away valleys northeast of Columbia, areas where roads barely existed and government authority rarely reached. The Talbot name appeared most often, connected to deals going back to 1890. What Finch discovered in those first weeks of investigating suggested that something terrible had been happening in Boone County for longer than anyone had imagined. System that treated human beings like property and kept its work hidden behind the walls of family loyalty and geographic separation. Grace Talbot was born in 1901 in a valley that had no official name on any map. The land belonged to her grandfather, Vernon Talbot, though ownership meant something different there than it did in the towns and cities beyond the mountain line. Vernon controlled everything within those valley walls. Who married whom, who worked which fields, who spoke, and who stayed silent. The property itself spread across 200 acres of woods and bottomland connected by walking paths that only family members knew. Cabins grouped near the creek built from logs cut on the property and arranged in a pattern that spoke to power structure rather than convenience. Vernon's house sat highest on the slope, looking down on the others like a watchtower. His sons and their families lived on the next level. Then came the unmarried adults, and finally the children's area, where Grace spent her early years. Visitors never came to the valley. The Talbots traded in Columbia occasionally, selling wood and furs, buying supplies that couldn't be made on the land. But these trips happened rarely and always under Vernon's watch. He kept relationships with certain shop owners and officials, relationships built on helping each other and careful silence about what happened in the hills. Grace learned early that women in the family existed to do specific jobs. They worked the gardens, saved food, made clothing, and had children. But more than that, they were things that Vernon managed with the same attention he gave to breeding farm animals. He studied family lines, tracked which girls got which traits, noted their looks and personalities in a leather journal he kept locked in his desk. By the time Grace turned 10, she understood that her cousin Sarah's disappearance the previous winter hadn't been a marriage to a farmer in the next county, despite what the adults claimed. Sarah had been 17, pretty and helpful. Vernon had called it a placement, a temporary deal that would help the family. Sarah returned 8 months later, thinner and quieter, her eyes holding something that Grace couldn't name but recognized as harm. Other cousins followed the same pattern. They'd be told they were going to work for a rich family or help an elderly widower manage his house or serve as a helper to a sick woman who needed care. The deals always came with money that went directly to Vern, never to the girls themselves. Some placements lasted months, others only weeks. The girls never spoke about where they'd been or what they'd done, and asking questions earned quick punishment. Vernon explained everything through the Bible and tradition. He preached on Sundays in the clearing behind his house, telling the family that their way of life kept old values that the outside world had abandoned. Women were meant to obey, children to serve, and the family to protect itself against government interference and modern problems. Anyone who questioned these teachings found themselves separated from others, denied food, or beaten in front of the others as a lesson. Grace's mother had been one of Vernon's daughters, married off to his nephew to keep family lines concentrated and loyalty complete. She'd had 6 children, 3 of whom survived past being babies. Grace was the oldest, which meant she'd been watching, learning, and understanding longer than her younger brothers. She knew what awaited her, knew that Vernon had already started judging her the way he judged horses before selling them. The valley operated as its own nation, ruled by Vernon's complete authority and protected by geography that made stepping in nearly impossible. Grace turned 14 in the spring of 1915, and that's when Vernon called her to his house for the first time alone. She climbed the path to his cabin with her stomach twisted, knowing that this conversation would change everything. Inside, he sat at his desk with the leather journal open, studying pages filled with his careful handwriting. He didn't waste time on friendly talk. The family had deals with certain men in the surrounding counties, he explained. Respectable men who needed help with their homes, who valued privacy and paid well for reliable service. These deals helped everyone. The men got help they couldn't find elsewhere. The family got income and protection, and the girls learned skills that would help them throughout their lives. Grace listened as Vernon described the system he'd built over decades. Each placement was carefully arranged with terms that said how long, payment, and expectations. The men were checked, their reputations confirmed, their ability to pay verified. Everything was written in his notebook, everything tracked with the care of a businessman managing valuable property. What he didn't say, but what Grace already understood, was that these deals had nothing to do with housework or real jobs. The girls who returned from placements carried a particular kind of harm, an emptiness that came from being used in ways that destroyed something basic. Vernon's careful words about house service and respectable homes hid a business built on taking advantage of people. The system worked because everyone involved had reasons to keep silent. The men who paid for these deals were often important in their communities. Shop owners, farmers with large property, sometimes even local officials. They couldn't risk being exposed for what they'd done. Vernon held power over them through the simple fact of their involvement, which gave him protection and influence that reached far beyond the valley. For the families providing the girls, being poor and far away made fighting back nearly impossible. Vernon's network included several other clans scattered through the central Missouri hills, all running similar systems and all protecting each other through helping each other stay silent. A family that refused to participate found itself cut off from trade, from marriage options, from the web of connections that made survival possible in those far-away areas. Grace learned that the notebook contained entries going back to 1890 when Vernon had first set up the system. Dozens of names, dozens of placements, a carefully kept record of deals that treated young women as property. Some girls had been placed many times, sent to different men as needed. Others had disappeared completely after certain deals, their fates unrecorded and unquestioned. Vernon showed Grace a page with her cousin Sarah's entries. 3 different placements over 2 years, each lasting several months, each bringing in large income for the family. Sarah had just been placed again, this time with a widower near Jefferson City who'd specifically asked for someone young and obedient. The note included details about payment terms and expected length. This was Grace's future laid out in Vernon's careful handwriting. She would be placed soon, he told her. Several men had already asked, and he was deciding which deal would prove most helpful. She should prepare herself mentally and understand that fighting back would be useless. The family's survival depended on these deals, and individual wants meant nothing against group necessity. Grace walked back down the path to her cabin, understanding that she'd just been given her sentence and that escape from Vernon's system seemed as impossible as escaping the valley itself. 3 years passed before Vern picked Grace's placement. She spent that time watching other girls leave and return, each one carrying the same defeated silence. Then in April 1918, Vernon told her she'd be going to August Dietrich, a German immigrant farmer whose wife had died the previous winter. Dietrich lived 30 miles west, far enough that Grace couldn't walk home even if she tried. Vernon and 2 of his sons drove her there in a wagon, the journey taking most of a day over rough country roads. They didn't speak to her during the trip, and she knew better than to ask questions. The Dietrich farm was larger than she'd expected, with good bottomland and a big house that spoke to years of successful harvests. August met them at the door, a man in his 50s with rough hands and eyes that wouldn't meet hers directly. Vernon and August spoke in low voices on the porch while Grace waited with her small bundle of belongings. Money changed hands. Vernon counted it carefully before shaking August's hand and leaving without saying goodbye to Grace. She watched the wagon disappear down the road, taking with it any illusion that this was anything other than a sale. August showed her to a small room off the kitchen, explaining in accented English that she'd be responsible for cooking, cleaning, and managing the household. His late wife had handled everything, and the farm had fallen into disorder since her death. Grace nodded, understanding that whatever he said about housework, the real expectations would show themselves soon enough. The first week passed in a blur of work. August's definition of household management included work that would have needed 3 women to complete properly. She woke before dawn to make breakfast, spent days washing clothes by hand, scrubbing floors, taking care of the vegetable garden, making meals, and doing tasks that left her exhausted by nightfall. But the housework was only part of what August had paid for. On the 8th night, he came to her room and made clear what Vernon's deal actually meant. Grace had known this was coming, had prepared herself as much as anyone could prepare for such things, but knowledge didn't make it easier to bear. The months that followed set up a routine of work and harm. August treated her with neither meanness nor kindness, simply as property he'd temporarily bought. He fed her enough, didn't beat her, and expected her to do the work that Vernon had agreed to. In his mind, everything was legitimate business. Grace discovered she was pregnant in September. August showed no particular reaction to this news, treating it as an expected result rather than a problem. He continued using her throughout the pregnancy, not caring about her discomfort or the dangers involved. When her time came in February 1919, August brought a midwife from town who asked no questions and accepted payment for silence. The birth was hard, lasting through a long winter night. Grace held her daughter for perhaps an hour before Vern arrived to take the baby. He'd arranged a placement for the child with his daughter Esther, who'd been unable to have babies. The baby would be raised as Esther's own, and Grace would never speak of the birth or claim any connection to the child. Vernon made this clear before he left with the baby wrapped in blankets. August drove Grace back to the valley 2 days later, already paid in full for the 6-month deal. Vernon counted her as property returned, ready for the next placement whenever demand required. The Talbot operation wasn't unique. Sheriff Finch's investigation in 1920 revealed at least 4 other families running identical systems throughout central Missouri. The Hackett clan in Callaway County, the Liddells near the Osage River, the Crenshaw family in the hills above Herman, all keeping the same careful silence about their deals. These families had worked for decades through a combination of being far away and smart relationships with local power structures. County officials who asked uncomfortable questions found themselves facing mysterious difficulties. Tax bills became unfavorable. Legal fights went against them. Business relationships got worse without explanation. The message was clear: certain questions shouldn't be asked. In 1916, a deputy named William Trowbridge tried to investigate rumors about the Crenshaw family after a girl from their property appeared in Herman with visible injuries. Trowbridge was young, new to the area, and didn't understand the unwritten rules that controlled these faraway communities. He began interviewing people, asking about family structures and unexplained disappearances. Trowbridge disappeared in November 1916. His horse returned without him, and searchers found no trace of his body. The official conclusion was that he'd fallen from his horse and drowned in the Gasconade River, though no evidence supported this theory. His personal investigation notes vanished from the sheriff's office, and the case was quietly closed. The network protected itself through helping each other. Men who'd paid for deals had every reason to make sure the system continued working without examination. Family patriarchs like Vernon kept detailed records on everyone involved, creating a web of compromised people who couldn't expose the network without implicating themselves. Local shop owners benefited from the family's business and asked no questions about where money came from. Some doctors and midwives had delivered babies from these deals, accepting payment for silence. Even certain preachers had blessed marriages between girls from the network and men who'd first met them through placements, making relationships that had begun as deals seem normal. The system also took advantage of legal limitations at the time. Law enforcement in rural Missouri was thin, with sheriffs covering huge territories and lacking resources for complex investigations. Family matters were considered private, and authorities were reluctant to step in what could be presented as family deals. Women had limited legal standing, and young women from faraway families had even less. Cultural attitudes made the network's stability stronger. The early 1900s still operated on beliefs about father's authority and family independence that made questioning these deals socially difficult. Communities valued privacy and self-sufficiency, viewing government stepping in as unwelcome intrusion, even when abuse was obvious. Vern's notebook later revealed payments to specific officials, though whether these were bribes or legitimate fees for services remained unclear. A justice of the peace in Cooper County had received regular money for performing marriages that connected network families. A county clerk had been paid for speeding up certain document filings while delaying others. These deals created financial ties that further protected the system. The network also kept its own internal enforcement. Families who considered breaking silence were reminded of what happened to those who betrayed the group. Girls who tried to escape found themselves hunted by relatives who dragged them back to face punishment that served as warning to others. The system kept itself going through fear being involved, and the calculated taking advantage of every weakness in rural law enforcement and social structures. By the time Grace returned from August Dietrich's farm, she understood that escape wasn't just a matter of running away. It required breaking down an entire network built on decades of calculated silence. Vernon gave Grace 6 months at the Valley before arranging her second placement. In January 1920, she found herself being delivered to Harold Kemp's home in Jefferson City. A large brick house on a tree-lined street that seemed impossibly distant from everything she'd known. Kemp was a businessman in his early 40s, a widower who'd made his fortune in lumber contracts with the state government. Vernon had arranged premium terms for this deal, double what August Dietrich had paid, reflecting both Kemp's wealth and Grace's proven ability to have babies. The deal was done in Kemp's study while Grace waited in the entrance hall, staring at wallpaper that probably cost more than everything her family owned. But Harold Kemp was not August Dietrich. He had two daughters aged 12 and 14 who lived with him and attended the local school. They stared at Grace with curiosity when she arrived, asking their father who she was and why she'd be staying with them. Kemp introduced her as a housekeeper, but the discomfort in his voice suggested he understood exactly what he'd actually bought. The first week passed strangely. Kemp seemed unsure how to proceed with the deal he'd paid for. He treated Grace with awkward formality, showing her the household routines and explaining what his daughters needed. His late wife had died 2 years earlier, and the house still carried traces of her presence in ways that made the situation feel even more wrong. Grace did her duties efficiently, caring for the girls and managing the household. She'd learned from her time with August that going along made things easier, and she had no reason to believe this placement would be any different once Kemp overcame his apparent hesitation. But on the 10th night, when Kemp finally came to her room, something unexpected happened. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, then apologized and left. Grace lay awake afterward, confused and afraid that his change of mind would somehow make things worse. The next morning, Kemp asked to speak with her privately. He said that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he hadn't fully understood what he was participating in when Vernon had approached him. His daughters were not much younger than Grace, and the deal felt like a betrayal of everything he wanted them to grow up believing about the world. Grace said nothing at first, trained by years in the valley to trust no one, especially men who claimed good intentions. But Kemp continued, explaining that he had a friend who'd prosecuted trafficking cases in Stain. Lewis, someone who might be able to help if Grace was willing to testify about what the Talbot family had done. The word trafficking meant nothing to Grace. She'd never heard the term applied to what Vernon did, had never imagined that the deals might be illegal rather than simply terrible. Kemp explained carefully, describing laws that stopped what he called white slavery, explaining that what Vernon ran was a criminal business that could be prosecuted if evidence could be gathered. Grace felt something shift inside her, a possibility she'd never allowed herself to consider. She began talking, telling Kemp everything about the valley, about Vernon's system, about the other families involved. Kemp took notes, his expression growing darker as she spoke. Within days, he'd contacted his lawyer friend and set in motion events that would either free Grace or get them both killed. Vernon's network had worked for 30 years without serious challenge, and they wouldn't give up their business without a fight. Harold Kemp understood that Grace couldn't stay in Jefferson City once Vernon realized something had gone wrong. The network had watchers throughout central Missouri, and a girl who vanished from a legitimate placement would trigger immediate searches. Kemp needed to move her somewhere beyond Vernon's reach, while his lawyer friend built a case strong enough to challenge the entire system. In early March 1920, Kemp arranged Grace's disappearance. He told his household staff that she'd received word of a family emergency and left suddenly. To Vernon, he sent a message claiming Grace had stolen money and run away, expressing his anger at being deceived about her character. The lie bought time, making Vernon believe Grace had simply run rather than telling the truth to outsiders. Kemp personally drove Grace to Kansas City, a journey of several hours that took them far beyond the territory Vernon's family controlled. He'd arranged lodging at a boarding house run by a widow named Margaret Hoffman, a woman he'd known through business connections and trusted to keep secrets. Grace was registered under the name Mary Sullivan, a fake name that would protect her while lawyers worked. The boarding house sat in a working-class neighborhood where newcomers attracted little attention. Grace shared a room with 2 factory workers who asked no questions about her background. Margaret provided meals and safety in exchange for help with housework, an arrangement that gave Grace legitimate work while she waited. But hiding meant living with constant fear. Every knock on the door might be Vernon's sons coming to drag her back. Every stranger on the street could be someone from the network who'd recognize her despite the distance. Grace rarely left the boarding house, spending her days helping Margaret and her nights lying awake, listening for sounds that might signal discovery. Meanwhile, Kemp's lawyer friend, a man named Robert Chen who'd successfully prosecuted several trafficking cases in St. Louis, began the dangerous work of building a legal case. He interviewed Grace extensively, writing down everything she remembered about Vernon's operation. The challenge was enormous. Grace's testimony alone wouldn't be enough to bring down a network that had worked for 3 decades. Chen needed Vernon's notebook, the physical evidence that documented the entire system. Kemp had copied what he could during Grace's stay, but those notes were secondhand and might not hold up in court. They needed the original, which meant somehow getting it from Vernon's locked desk in a property surrounded by family members who'd killed to protect their secrets. In April, Vernon's sons appeared in Jefferson City asking questions about Grace. They visited businesses, spoke with Kemp's neighbors, and made clear through barely hidden threats that they wanted information about where she'd gone. Kemp kept to his story about being a victim of theft, playing the role of an angry customer demanding Vern control his family members better. The visit terrified Grace when Kemp reported it during one of his careful trips to Kansas City. Vernon's reach extended farther than she'd hoped, and his determination to find her suggested he understood that her disappearance represented a threat to his entire operation. A girl who simply ran away was one thing. A girl who might be talking to authorities was something else entirely. Chen warned that they were running out of time. Either they moved forward with prosecution soon, accepting the limitations of their evidence, or Vernon would eventually find Grace and silence her permanently. The decision fell to Grace herself. Risk everything on an imperfect case, or spend the rest of her life hiding from the family that considered her property. Robert Chen made a decision that changed everything. He contacted federal investigators in St. Louis, framing the Talbot network as an interstate trafficking operation. If Grace had been transported across county lines for immoral purposes, and if the network had worked in multiple counties, federal jurisdiction applied. That meant resources and authority that local Missouri officials couldn't provide. 2 federal agents arrived in Kansas City in late May 1920. They interviewed Grace over 3 days, taking detailed statements about every placement, every deal she'd witnessed, every name she could remember. The questioning was exhausting and humiliating, forcing her to describe experiences she'd tried to bury. But the agents treated her testimony seriously, recognizing patterns they'd seen in city trafficking cases. What made Grace's account particularly valuable was her knowledge of Vernon's paperwork system. She described the leather notebook in detail, explained how Vernon recorded every deal, and identified other families involved in the network. This information gave investigators specific targets and evidence to pursue. The agents began quiet interviews with other women who'd escaped or been released from similar deals. Some refused to speak, too afraid of payback or too damaged to relive their experiences. But others came forward, each testimony adding another piece to the pattern Chen was building. A woman named Elizabeth Hackett, who'd been part of the Callaway County network, provided details that supported Grace's account. She'd been placed with 5 different men over 4 years before being married off to a farmer who'd wanted permanent ownership rather than temporary rental. Her husband had died in 1918, finally freeing her to speak without fear of his payback. Another woman, Martha Liddell, described being sold at age 15 to a merchant in Boonville. She'd had 3 children during that placement, all taken by her family immediately after birth. Martha had eventually been returned to the Liddell property when the merchant tired of her, where she was married to her cousin and forbidden from ever mentioning what had happened. By July, investigators had documented 34 women who'd been taken advantage of through the network. The actual number was certainly higher, but many victims had died, disappeared, or refused to come forward. Even these 34 cases represented decades of systematic abuse that had worked with complete freedom from punishment. The federal agents decided to move against Vernon directly. On August 12, 1920, they arrived at the valley with local sheriff deputies and warrants for Vernon's arrest. The family initially tried to refuse them entry, but the presence of federal authority and armed deputies made resistance impossible. Vernon was taken into custody along with 3 of his sons who'd actively participated in arranging placements. Investigators seized Vernon's notebook from his desk along with boxes of letters and financial records that documented the entire operation. The evidence was even more complete than Grace had described, containing details about deals going back 30 years. Other families in the network learned quickly about Vernon's arrest. Some tried to destroy their own records. Others ran to relatives in different states. The Crenshaw family burned their property completely, eliminating evidence but also drawing attention that led to their eventual prosecution. Grace remained in Kansas City throughout the raids, protected by federal agents who understood that Vernon's family would target her if given the opportunity. She'd set everything in motion by trusting Harold Kemp, and now the entire network faced exposure. Whether the legal system would actually deliver justice remained uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Grace allowed herself to hope. The trial began in October 1920 in the federal courthouse in Columbia, drawing newspaper attention from across Missouri. Reporters filled the gallery, though editors carefully managed their coverage to avoid specific details about the nature of the crimes. Headlines spoke of white slavery rings and rural trafficking networks, using language that acknowledged horror while protecting readers from its full scope. Vernon Talbot sat at the defense table next to his sons, all 3 keeping expressions of righteous anger. Their lawyer, a Columbia lawyer named Thomas Burdett, built a defense around family independence and agreed upon deals. These were household employment agreements, he argued, legitimate placements of family members in respectable households. Any suggestion of forcing or taking advantage was made up by troubled girls seeking attention. The prosecution opened with Vernon's notebook, entering it as evidence and carefully walking the jury through years of documented deals. Each entry showed a pattern: young women's names, ages, length of placement, and payment amounts. The notebook went against any claim of legitimate employment. No housekeeper was rented by the month, with detailed payment schedules that looked like farm animal sales. Robert Chen called Grace as his first witness. She took the stand wearing a simple dress provided by Margaret Hoffman, her hands shaking as she swore the oath. Chen guided her through her testimony carefully, establishing her background in the valley, describing the system Vern had explained to her at 14, and detailing her placements with August Dietrich and Harold Kemp. Burdett's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested Grace had been a willing participant who now made up abuse claims out of anger. He questioned why she'd never tried escape during her first placement, implying that happiness rather than forcing explained her going along. Grace answered quietly, explaining that escape had been impossible when she had nowhere to go and no understanding that what Vernon did was illegal. The prosecution called other victims over the following days. Elizabeth Hackett described her 4 years in the Callaway County network. Martha Little testified about losing 3 children to forced adoption. Each woman's testimony built on the others, creating a portrait of systematic taking advantage that no defense argument could fully dismiss. Harold Kemp testified about his deal with Vernon, admitting his own guilt while explaining how the system worked from a buyer's perspective. His testimony was devastating because it came from someone with no reason to lie, a respectable businessman confessing his participation in crimes that destroyed young women's lives. August Dietrich was forced to testify under subpoena. He said that he'd believed the deal was legitimate, that Vern had presented Grace as a willing worker seeking employment. But under Chen's questioning, Dietrich admitted he'd never asked Grace directly if she wanted to be there, never asked about her ability to leave, never questioned why a 17-year-old girl would be available for a 6-month placement far from her family. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Burdett called character witnesses who described Vernon as a pillar of his community, a religious man who'd raised his family according to traditional values. But these testimonials collapsed against the weight of Vernon's own notebook and the testimony of women he'd taken advantage of. The jury discussed for 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Vernon was convicted of conspiracy, getting people for immoral purposes, and multiple counts related to interstate trafficking. 2 of his sons received similar convictions. Sentencing came quickly. Vernon received 20 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for a man in his 60s. Grace watched the verdicts from the gallery, surrounded by federal agents who'd protected her throughout the trial. Justice had arrived, imperfect and incomplete, but real nonetheless. Vernon Talbot died in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in 1923, 3 years into his sentence. Prison records listed heart failure as the cause, though some believed he'd simply given up once his empire collapsed. His sons served their full terms, released in the early 1930s to a world that had forgotten their crimes and families that wanted nothing to do with them. The network Vern built didn't survive his conviction. Federal prosecutions took apart the other families involved, with the Hacketts, Liddells, and Crenshaws all facing charges that sent patriarchs to prison and scattered their clans. The property in the valley was left empty within months of the trial. The cabins left to rot as family members spread out to avoid the shame of association. Grace never returned to Missouri. With help from Robert Chen and Margaret Hoffman, she traveled to California in early 1921, carrying letters of introduction to families who might employ her for real. She found work with a family in San Diego, a position that offered dignity rather than being taken advantage of. In 1924, she met a carpenter named James Whitlock, who knew nothing of her past. They married that summer, and Grace became someone entirely new, building a life defined by choices rather than deals. She had 3 children who grew up believing their mother had come from a small Missouri town, nothing more. The truth about the valley remained locked away, shared with no one except James, who loved her enough to never ask for details she couldn't bear to give. Grace lived quietly for decades, raising her children and working alongside James in the carpentry business they built together. She never spoke publicly about what had happened until 1959, when a researcher studying rural crime in early 1900s Missouri tracked her down through court records. The interview was brief and carefully controlled. Grace, then 58 years old, spoke about the system Vern had run but avoided personal details that might hurt her again or compromise the privacy she'd built. She wanted the story written down, she explained, because silence had protected men like Vern for too long. Future generations needed to understand how taking advantage thrived in faraway communities where women had no legal protection and family authority worked without oversight. The researcher's work remained unknown, published in an academic journal that few people read. Grace's story stayed buried in archives until the 1990s, when historians looking at rural Missouri discovered the trial documents and began piecing together the full scope of what had happened in those remote valleys. By then, Grace had been dead for 15 years, having lived to 73 before passing peacefully in her sleep. Her children learned the truth about their mother's early life only after her death, when the historians contacted them seeking permission to include her story in their research. They granted it, understanding that their mother's courage deserved recognition, even if she'd never sought it herself. The valley where Grace was born is gone now, taken back by forest with barely a trace of the cabins that once stood there. But the records remain, kept in federal archives and county historical societies, documenting a system that took advantage of dozens of women across 3 decades before one 19-year-old girl found the courage to speak and the luck to be heard. Grace's story reminds us that evil often hides in plain sight, protected by silence and made normal through tradition, and that sometimes one voice is enough to bring it down. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the systems that still take advantage of the vulnerable today, click that like button and subscribe. We uncover the buried truths that demand to be remembered. Share this story because Grace's courage deserves to be known, and because the best way to prevent history from repeating is to refuse to forget it ever happened.